Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church, a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California.
We meet in person and online on Sundays at 10 a.m. Pacific Time. Our in-person service is held indoors at Joslyn Park Auditorium, which is at 633 Kensington Road.
And our pre-recorded online service can be found on our website, solachurch.life, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. That's at Sola Church LA.
And we have a great service for you today. Let's worship.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. And you have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. And you have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't turn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. And you have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't turn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till love found me's the 99. I couldn't turn it, I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out today, please don't feel like you have to participate. But if Sola Church is your church home or these online services have been a blessing to you, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to schedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to scan the QR code on your screen, but you can always go to solachurch.life and click the tab at the top that says Give.
Thank you so much for your generosity. You're making it possible for us to reach the west side of LA and beyond.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
Discrimination. Yeah. A dictionary definition: unfair treatment of a person or group on the basis of prejudice. Like, we see discrimination at work, we see discrimination at school, we see discrimination at home, we see discrimination at church. Wait, what? At church? What does the Bible say about that? Let's turn to James chapter 2 as we continue our series, Next Level. It's so easy to settle in life. But what if God is calling you to grow, to lead, to live boldly? That's why this verse-by-verse series through the book of James called Next Level. It's all about practical, powerful faith that makes a difference in real life. This is the series that says, don't settle, go next level. Let's begin in verse 1. It says, "My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality." The Greek noun translated partiality means favoritism. Think discrimination. What comes to mind when you think about discrimination? The first thing that comes to my mind is racism. And that has been just as big an issue in the 2020s as I can remember. Think about names like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, there have just been so many things in the 2020s that have really been a reckoning of sorts for us as a nation. But of course, there are many other isms. I think of sexism, around gender. I think of ageism around age. We discriminate against people on the basis of their income, on the basis of their influence, maybe on the basis of their physical appearance, or because they have a physical disability. We discriminate against people because of their marital status. Some of our single friends would say that they have felt discriminated against because they're single. And certainly for me and for Miranda, as members of the divorced and remarried community, we know what it's like to feel discriminated against for that reason as well. And of course, I think of, people who are experiencing discrimination around issues like sexual orientation or gender identity. I mean, regardless of what you think about, those issues or other issues, it's terrible that we would ever discriminate against people for any of the reasons above. There is this incompatibility between devotion and discrimination, between faith and favoritism, between piety and partiality. How so? Well, notice in that first verse, James, talking about his half-brother Jesus, refers to him as the Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. This is a reminder that Jesus was the first person on the list of those who might have thought of themselves as being superior. He actually was and is. He's the Son of God. He's God the Son. He's the Lord of glory. And yet, in spite of that, he didn't discriminate. Racism, well, we see him talking to Samaritans who were only half Jewish and to Gentiles who obviously weren't Jewish at all. Sexism, we see him talking to women. Ageism, we see him talking to people of all ages. Income and influence, we see him talking to people from all walks of life. Meanwhile, if he was the first person on the list of those who might have thought of themselves as superior, he was the last person who had any reason to think of himself as being inferior. And yet, in spite of that, people did discriminate against him. They discriminated against him because they, thought that he was born to a single mom. They discriminated against him because he was from the wrong side of the tracks. They discriminated against him because to their way of thinking, he was uneducated. So what I'm getting at is this, that when we discriminate, we're nothing like Jesus. And when we're discriminated against, we're just like Jesus. The Greek verb that James uses that's translated, do not hold, is imperative, which means that this prohibition is not a suggestion, it's a command. Picking up the text in verse 2, he says, for if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings in fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit here at my footstool. Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So here James creates a hypothetical. I don't think he was talking about a specific incident, but he creates a hypothetical around a couple of guys. We'll call them rich guy and poor guy. So their clothes he describes as fine and filthy, respectively. The Greek adjective translated fine means bright. So, the rich guy as compared to poor guy, we could think of it as new clothes versus old clothes, colorful clothes versus colorless clothes, clothes that maybe still had the tags on them, and clothes that maybe had patches on them. The reference to the gold rings in verse 2, you'll notice that rings is plural. So rich guy is rocking the bling. He's all blinged out. And so what we see in this hypothetical is that rich guy gets to sit while poor guy has to stand. Rich guy is shown to a seat while poor guy is shown to the floor, that or the door. Rich guy receives preferential treatment. Poor guy, well, they pretend he doesn't exist. That doesn't happen, does it? At church? Oh man. We have to see the big picture of discrimination in all of its forms, even in church life. And the ways that we may be guilty of marginalizing people. All the ways that we decide who matters and who doesn't. Often it's more subtle than the hypothetical that James creates, but while it may be more subtle, we are no less guilty. How can we stop? What can we do? Well, I think number one, it's all about seeing people the way God does. Let's talk about that, beginning in verse 5. Listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called? Now, what James is describing was not without exception. Here's what he's not saying. He's not saying that all poor people are going to heaven and all rich people are going to hell. What is he saying? Well, in some ways, it takes us back to verses that we didn't take a very deep look at back in chapter 1. And we still aren't going to take that deep a look. I mean, it's something that James is going to talk more about later in the letter. But in James 1, verses 9 through 11, he talks about the poor and the rich. And he seems to suggest there that, at least in some ways, the poor are spiritually advantaged while the rich are spiritually disadvantaged. And maybe that's true, at least in the sense that, our poverty puts us in a position where we have to be more dependent on God. When we have everything we need, it's a little bit easier to be dependent, or independent, that is, of God. But when we don't feel like we have everything we need, we're more dependent on God. But if nothing else, the takeaway would be that things are not always what they appear to be. So verses 6 and 7, let's look first at the latter part of that, which deals with the rich. Beginning in the middle of verse 6, do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called? It's possible that, remember last week we talked about how, church didn't look anything like it does for us. For them, it looked different. They were almost certainly meeting in homes. They didn't have church buildings. They were, in fact, meeting in homes. But rather than, a monologue like this, they were having a dialogue. And rather than sitting in rows like we do at in-person church, they likely were sitting in a circle. And it's possible that in those situations, when a rich person came in, that everyone else was sort of starstruck. Now remember, and James is reminding us, remember who he was writing to. He was writing to Jewish Christians scattered throughout the Roman Empire. They had been persecuted, forced from their homes and from their home country. And so they found themselves in these remote parts of the Roman Empire where they were persecuted by the Gentiles because they were Jews, and by other Jews because they were Christians. And so they were, the victims of injustice and oppression, and this had actually impoverished them. We've talked in previous lessons about how people wouldn't hire them, or people wouldn't come to their businesses, wouldn't do business with them, and so they were truly struggling financially. These poor Jewish Christians were being exploited. They were being persecuted, and as it implies in verses 6 and 7, verse 6, the end of verse 6, they were being prosecuted. So, the answer to this discrimination wasn't and isn't ever reverse discrimination. That wasn't the solution. The solution to them being discriminated against wasn't for them to just turn around and discriminate against others. And so let's flip back and look then at what comes before that in verse 5, in the first half of verse 6, where he said, listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. So, whom God chose, verse 5, you dishonored, verse 6. What a tragedy for you or for me to dishonor the very ones that God has chosen, which takes us back to how we see people. If there's one place on earth where we should see people through God's eyes, it's the church. For real though, right? Like if there's one place on earth, shouldn't it be the church? And yet many times even in church, and many times even church people categorize and label people. Do you ever ignore people because of the color of their skin? Because they're a man or a woman? Because they're elderly? Or because they're just a kid? Because they're in a different tax bracket? Do you ever discriminate because they're unattractive in your eyes? Because they're disabled? Because they're overweight? Because they're tattooed? Because they're pierced? When we do that, what we're saying is, you matter and you don't. Howard Hendricks said, always remember that labels are libel. No wonder back in verse 4, James suggested that these kinds of thoughts are evil. They're evil thoughts. So we need to see people the way God does. And we need to remember that we've never locked eyes with anyone, who wasn't created by God, who wasn't made in God's image, who doesn't matter deeply to God. People matter to God, and they must matter to us. So, we're talking about discrimination, and we're talking about first seeing people the way God does. But now let's talk about seeing the problem the way God does. Picking it up in verse 8, James writes, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, now he's quoting from the Torah, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So when I said James was quoting the Torah, he was quoting Leviticus 19, verse 18. Jesus would couple that with Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, when he was asked, what the greatest commandment was. And Jesus, quoting Deuteronomy said, love God, and then quoting Leviticus said, love people. So a lot of times we call this the great commandment. Jesus' command that we love God and love people. But here in verse 8, James calls it the royal law. In John chapter 17, in what we call the Upper Room Discourse, it was a talk that Jesus gave the night before he was arrested. And, he would be arrested later that night, but then hours later in the next day, he would be crucified. But there Jesus, talked about loving others, and he called it a new commandment. How could it be new if we find it in the Torah? Well, it was new in its emphasis, but it was new too in its example. Jesus said that we should love one another as he loved us. And of course, Jesus gave his life for us. So new in its emphasis and new in its example. One time when Jesus was talking about this very thing, he was talking about neighbor love, about loving our neighbor. And so someone pushed back by asking, who is my neighbor? We might not say it in those words, but the truth is we tend to think of easy to love people as our neighbors and hard to love people as non-neighbors. Jesus told a story that we call the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you've never read it, I encourage you to look it up and read it. Just Google it and you'll find out where to look it up. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he chooses to make the least likely person to be a neighbor. And it just reminds us that when we ask, who is my neighbor, we're asking the wrong question. A better question is, to whom can I be a neighbor? And of course, we can be a neighbor to anyone. In that 9th verse, he said, if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So that's pretty straight up. Like, he's not beating around the bush. When you do this, when you discriminate, when you show favoritism, when you show partiality, you sin. Straight up. So when it comes to the problem of partiality, we need to see it the way God does. Discriminate, and it's not just bad manners. Discriminate, and it's not just discourteous. Discriminate, and it's not just impolite, it's sin. So verses 10 and 11, for whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he's guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about these verses. Obviously, any do-good approach to going to heaven is doomed to fail, because you could think about the commands like, a chain, and you break any one link and the chain is broken. That's part of the idea here. But I think it's interesting that when, James is having a conversation around how to see the problem of partiality, and he wants to compare it to some other sins, and he goes deep. Like he talks about adultery and murder. Oh my goodness, that can't be good. I mean, that if that's the comparison, then that tells us that God takes this stuff seriously, and so should we. So many times people of faith take the so-called sins of the flesh so seriously, but then are completely dismissive of the sins of the Spirit in general, and of discrimination in particular. And to God, the one is just as serious as the other. Can I give another example of how sometimes we discriminate, show favoritism or partiality? Sometimes, we discriminate against the new people, against the new person. Have you ever been the new person in your life? I have often been the new person in life, going all the way back to my childhood. When I was growing up, those years that I went to school, talking about, from kindergarten through high school, I did that in 3 different states. I think I attended 8 different schools. And so I was so often the new person at school, and the new person at church, and the new person in the neighborhood. And it wasn't always easy. Sometimes I was picked on. Sometimes I was picked on for no other reason than that I was the new kid. I remember as far back as my kindergarten year, I was halfway through the year, I was so advanced compared to the rest of the class that they wanted to promote me mid-year to first grade. But when I got to first grade, they were so mean to me. I was the new kid, and they were bullying me and picking on me, and they were so mean to me that I begged my mom to ask if they would put me back in my kindergarten class. And so she did, and they did. And I went back to my kindergarten class. And that sort of set the tone, man. I wish I could say that was the end of that kind of thing for me, but it wasn't. It was just the beginning. I would have many experiences like that growing up. But sometimes we discriminate against the new person. And you know where that can sometimes manifest? Is at church. It might be hard for you to believe, but there are actually people who don't want to see their church grow. I remember when I was pastoring the church that I founded in Austin, Texas, the church that I founded with 4 people, and we saw it grow to 1,400. I led that church for 18 years. And we moved many times throughout those years. We moved from the apartment complex where we started to a hotel, to a bigger hotel, to sharing space with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They met on Saturday and Wednesday, so we met on Sunday and Thursday, to leasing a storefront, to buying a grocery store and, gutting it and transforming it into worship space. That was a lot of growth over those years. And it was interesting because I remember when we were in the leased space and raising funds to purchase the building, there were people that didn't understand why we needed to do that. I remember, having conversations with people who were like, do we really need to do that? Why do we need to do that? And the funny thing is that I had had those same conversations with other people about 6 years before when we were meeting at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I remember being at the Adventist Church with maybe a couple hundred people coming on the weekend and talking to the church about, the need to move into this much larger leased space. And I can remember a specific conversation with a guy in the lobby where he was like, why do we need to do that? Do we really need to do that? And then here I am 6 years later with about 1,000 people coming on the weekend and having this conversation about moving, buying a building, moving from this lease space into a building that we would buy and remodel, and having these same conversations again. And so I actually asked the church one Sunday morning, I asked for a show of hands of all the people there who had never attended at any previous location. They'd only come to our church at that leased location, that leased storefront. And hundreds of hands went up in every service. People that might never have come to our church had it not been for that move, had it not been for that relocation, had it not been for that fundraising and so forth. And it's just so sad. Like, what if we had listened to the voices that really didn't want to see the church grow when we were at the Adventist Church? All of these people wouldn't even have been there to now have the same mentality of, we like it the way it is. We don't want it to grow. Let's just stay where we are. Oh, man. We never learn. We never learn. There are other people who want the church to grow as long as they approve of the people that are coming, as long as they approve of the new people, as long as they're comfortable with who they're sitting next to, as long as they're comfortable with the person who's in the youth group with their kids, as long as they're comfortable with the person who's in the children's ministry with their children, then they're okay with it. Otherwise, I remember a conversation once with someone who was leaving their church for another because they didn't approve of some of the kids in the youth group. They didn't want their kids in that youth group with those kids. And I was so disappointed by that. I was so bummed that there was like nothing missional about their whole perspective. And I remember sharing that anecdotally with another pastor, thinking that he would see it the way I did. And I was shocked when he didn't. He totally understood and related to the way that that parent felt. And I just thought, oh my gosh, even some of our spiritual leaders have lost the plot. Don't understand what it is that we're doing. You know, this has happened over and over again throughout church history. In the 18th century, the Church of England had gotten to the place where common people didn't even feel comfortable attending. And so they'd stopped attending the Church of England altogether. And when a guy named John Wesley, maybe you've heard of him, pretty famous guy, when John Wesley wanted to reach those people, he had to go outside the church to do it. And so he did what we call open air preaching. He would actually gather crowds in fields and preach to them there. There's a story about one occasion where he was preaching in the open air in a large field to about 30,000 coal miners, men who were not welcome in the Church of England. And their faces were blackened, from working in the mines. And as John Wesley was sharing the love of God with them, many of them began to weep. And it was said that the tears were, cutting a path through, all the grime on their faces. You could see these white streaks where the tears were running down their face. You could see among the 30,000 men, you could see hundreds or thousands that had these white streaks on their face. But then, in the very next century, in the 19th century, the very denomination that Wesley would go on to found had the same problem, repeated the same mistakes. So much so that when a guy named William Booth wanted to reach the common people, he had to go outside that church to do it. And so he started the Salvation Army. That's how the Salvation Army got started. Oh boy. Our church, Sola Church, is a part of Calvary Global Network, which has its roots in the Calvary Chapel movement, the Jesus movement of the late 60s and early 70s that began. It had its epicenter at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa. It started this same way. You had the hippies that weren't welcome in the mainline churches. They weren't welcome to come in with their long hair and their bare feet and, with their lifestyle and all of that. And, Chuck and Kay Smith welcomed the hippies at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. And that little tiny church that had 25 people in it when Chuck Smith took over grew to many thousands. At one time, it was one of the largest churches in the country. And of course, now there are many churches, well over 1,000 churches. I mean, I think last I recall, it was like 1,500 churches or something around the country that had sprung up, that were affiliated in one way or another with Calvary Chapel. And so, I mean, what an amazing move of God. But if we're not careful, we're going to make the same mistakes. And I think we're seeing that in some cases already. We might be in danger of becoming exclusive, of becoming intolerant, of becoming the place where people don't feel welcome. So as we talk about all of this, as we talk about how we want to deal with discrimination, we first need to see the people the way God does. We need to see then the problem the way God does, but we also need to see the possibilities the way God does. Look at verses 12 and 13. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Sometimes it can be helpful to review the difference between justice, mercy, and grace. Justice is when we get what we deserve. Mercy is when we don't get what we deserve. And grace is when we get what we don't deserve. You know, there's a saying, and it's true, we can't give what we haven't got. And so if we can't give mercy and grace to others, to people that maybe are different than us, there's a question about whether we've ever gotten it ourselves, whether we have received God's mercy and God's grace. Back in verse 5, it talks about those whom God has chosen. And of course, that's true about every follower of Jesus. Every Christ follower has been chosen, which means that for you and for me, when it comes to God's mercy and God's grace, we can't earn it. We don't deserve it. We just receive it. And if we've done that, how could we ever refuse that to anyone else? James here reminds us that one day we are all going to have a life review. And this particular issue is going to be an issue that day, in that moment. So, you know, what James is referring to is what we know from not just this, but other passages like Romans 14 and 2 Corinthians 5 as the judgment seat of Christ. For us as people of faith, as followers of Jesus, our life review will take place at the judgment seat of Christ. And in Romans 14, verse 12, it says that there we will give an account. As followers of Jesus, all of our sins have been forgiven. And so it's not a matter of punishment. We're not there to be punished, but it is a matter of reward. When you read 1 Corinthians 3, beginning in verse 12, you have kind of a description of, you know, how that will take place, those works for which we'll receive rewards. But that suggests that there is not only the possibility for reward, but the possibility for the loss of reward. And one of the things at issue is the way we treat people. That's right. In our life review, it's going to matter how we treated people at home, how we treated people at work, how we treated people at school, how we treated people at church. When it says in verse 13 that mercy triumphs, mercy is a far better way over and against the judgmentalism described back in verse 4. You know, church, our church, Sola Church, every church. Church should be the most loving place on earth. Church should be the most accepting place on earth. Church should be the most forgiving place on earth. That's why, you know, our heart from the beginning has been that Sola Church would be a place where outsiders would be the new insiders, where people would know that we see them, that they matter, that they're not less than, where people would know that they're loved by God and by us. This Sola Church would be a place where anyone could believe and everyone would belong. You know, I love it in Romans 2, verse 11, where it says that there is no partiality with God. Aren't you glad? Wherever you're at spiritually today, wherever you're at in your journey, whether you're a person of faith, whether you're growing in faith, whether you're returning to faith, whether you're new to faith, whether you're just kicking the tires of faith, God is not going to turn the cold shoulder to you. He's not going to play hard to get with you. He's not going to be standoffish. He's not going to be aloof. He's not going to be reserved, but he's there for you. Aren't you glad? Father, thank you so much that you accept us just the way we are. You love us just the way we are. Lord, would you help us to accept and love the people around us, all of the people around us, those who are easy to love and those who are hard to love. Would you help us, Lord, to renounce discrimination and favoritism and partiality. Lord, may the isms that we talked about earlier in this message just be far from us. May Sola Church be a place, Lord, where truly anyone can believe and where truly everyone belongs. And may we all make it a point to do our part to make it that kind of culture. And may we never lose a heart for the new people. Not just the new people who might come, but the new people who we ought to bring. And Lord, may we grow together. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
And now it's time to fill out a Connect card.
Yeah, just go to our website, solachurch.life, and scroll to the bottom of the homepage. That's where the Connect card lives. It's where you can let us know that you watched for the first time today. It's also where you can request information about our virtual small group. Super fun. We'd love for you to be a part.
And don't forget, go and follow Sola Church on social media.
Right, totally. It's at Sola Church LA on all your favorite apps. Let's connect.
And we hope that everyone has a great week. And we will see you next time at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody.